we've to kind of frame this discussion, we've just put together a little graph showing you on the basis of the same baseline, what are the decarbonization commitments by leading G20 economies? And what you can see here from this graph is that actually there's a lot of smokescreen in some of the national determined contribution, but that actually the UK and us in Europe, we are clearly leading. And regrettably, a number of other OECD economies have much lower ambition than we have. And of course, many developing economies, their issue is not to curb emissions, but actually to, reduce the pace of increase of their greenhouse gas emissions. So this is kind of the world we are in. This is the world where we have now engaged our decarbonization in Europe. And actually, there is no option but to succeed. And so we believe that we need in Europe a much more robust climate security agenda to do that. And that climate security agenda would actually encompass first effectively decarbonizing our economies, because we have just so far touched up in the low-hanging fruits. Now we are really entering into the very hard and very difficult actually issues, not just electricity, but of course all the sectors. And of course we have to do that without weakening our institutions, our democracies, our economies, our societies, but actually in strengthening them further. And we have to also push the other emitters in the world to do much more, because otherwise we won't be able to stay below 2 degrees. And that requires a very robust external Green Deal strategy that so far has been missing. And we've just raised a proposal to set up an international minerals agency as part of that. But of course, there's many other aspects. And then, of course, we have to ramp up in Europe and globally adaptation efforts, because it's not just about mitigation anymore. Adaptation will be key, and of course, prepare for a much more destabilized world coming forward. So that being said, today we're here to talk about the Fit for 55 package. We have, as I mentioned, these two great guests, and so the way we will handle this discussion is we will split it into 4 parts, so 4 questions to which both MEPs will answer on the Fit for 55 package. And you are all invited to lay out your own questions in the Q&A box, and my colleague Carole Mathieu will work on them and package them, and then at the end ask them to each of our 2 speakers today. So please do so, not just at the end, so that Carole has also the time to put them together. So to start with, I'd like to turn to Pascal Canfin. Pascal, first, perhaps talking about the social dimension of the Fit for 55 package. Is basically the package fit to keep societies supporting the transformation, to avoid that there's too many cliffs within the society? We are at a time when energy prices are soaring all across Europe, and to the extent that it has triggered notably alarm bells in Spain, but it's also biting as the winter's coming, especially in the German electoral context. So what's your view on that, Pascal, perhaps in a couple of minutes, and then we'll hear Henrike Hahn on her view on that. Thank you, Pascal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you to Ifri for organizing such an event. I hope that you can hear me well. I'm happy to be with you, perfect. So a few thoughts to start with on the social dimension. First, we should never forget that the cost of inaction will be much higher than the cost of action. So the impact on farmers of a 4 degrees world will be much more significant and dramatic than the impact of climate policies on them. So we really need to compare not the business as usual scenario when you do nothing and the climate policy scenario, but the scenario where you have a smooth and orderly transition and the scenario of what we can call climate chaos. Because business as usual will never be there anymore, and we know that. Second, we know that Frans Timmermans is right when he says if it's not a just transition, there will be no just no transition. He's right, and that's why we started among the first Green Deal steps, I would say, we started with the Just Transition Fund. And we are very careful about this dimension. And with the French background, I'm even more careful because we know that if we are not very cautious about this, then we can end up with the yellow jackets. That's why I'm very much supportive of the Fit for what we call in the Parliament, Fit for 2030 package, because actually what we negotiated in the climate law is more than 55, it's more close to 57 emission reduction. So we call it the Fit for 2030 package. We are very supportive. I am very supportive. France is very supportive. But I must say that on one specific text, which is the extension of the ETS to road transport and to buildings, the heating of buildings, we are very skeptical. We are very skeptical because we think, and I think, that there is a huge political risk and not that much climate gain. And we can get the same objective using other tools that are politically much less risky. So fully aware of that dimension of the social need for managing the transition. And my conclusion would be that my mantra in the Parliament is to transform without splitting. Because if we split societies, if we split communities, territories, we will go backward. And if I take again the French case as illustrative, but you have this one in Switzerland. A couple of weeks ago, the whole climate law of Switzerland was killed because exactly of that issue of carbon price on fuel. If you do not have the right policy tools, then you split and then forget about moving forward before years and years. On carbon pricing on fuels, even the Greens are not mushing in anymore in France, just because it's politically too sensitive. Even what we had with the convention, the Citizen Convention for Climate, they started to say, well, we are not going to touch upon that issue because it's too sensitive. So it gives you an example, a concrete example in the real world, that if you do it wrong, and if you split society, you lose a decade. And obviously, we cannot afford this decade. So that's why we really need to be very, very careful with this issue. And that's why we will be very, very careful about this extension of the ETS to road transport and buildings, because it has a detrimental potential from the social perspective.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Henrike, I pass you the floor.
Thank you, dear. Thank you very much for the wonderful invitation today. I'm happy to be here with you and to discuss that. That's wonderful. So actually, we know the ongoing transition from fossil fuels toward renewable energy sources is unprecedented, challenging, and with a strict deadline. And at the same time, the transition creates the need and offers an enormous opportunity to get our societies, economies, and industries just and fair. And it's clear that this process needs not only acceptance of the citizens, but also the support and the benefit, right, from this process. And we must, of course, you were mentioning it at the beginning, we must democratically reshape our economies to be more equal, inclusive, diverse, circular, sustainable. And this deep societal transformation must be developed in an inclusive way, protecting and guaranteeing the rights of all. So actually, it's always the case that climate action must improve the living and working conditions of all people and communities globally to be truly just. And currently, I think there is an overwhelming public support for ambitious EU climate action. We see that when we look on the polls carried out by the Eurobarometer, for example, published in July. this year, climate change is the single most serious problem facing the world. So people are aware that this is a problem we have to solve. And more than 9 out of 10 people surveyed consider climate change to be a serious problem, with almost 8 out of 10 considering it to be very serious. So actually, we know that we have to work on that, but of course in a social just way. And as someone, that is why in the 2 regulations, for example, of the Just Transition Mechanism, a very important file, the first Green Deal file we worked on in the Parliament, and I was rapporteur for in Econ, namely in the Just Transition Funded, but as well in the Public Sector Loan Facility, I was always also working as rapporteur on. We put a great emphasis that the Just Transition plans are prepared in social dialogue and cooperation with the relevant stakeholders, the local and regional authorities of the territories concerned, means also with the people concerned by that transition process, that they can really debate with us on that, on these important questions. And I think it's a very important fund, a key tool to support and to establish the framework of cohesion policy, which is the main EU policy instrument to reduce regional disparities. And of course, let's see what happens in the following, but I think this is a tool that the EU was creating in a very constructive way. And I don't know, we don't have so much time, I think, because it's an endless topic, because of course, at the moment, we also have a huge debate in Germany about these kind of issues, how you can get also at the national level that just transition, and there are very concrete and very helpful propositions to do that, and we also have to work on that on the European level as well. And yeah, so I think lots of things to say but in that regard, but maybe we could continue that in the discussion further on. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. And just to precise for our listeners that indeed a carbon tax on fuel and residential heating has been introduced on January 1st in Germany. And that, of course, this is a major issue in the current campaign as to whether that should be further raised or further coordinated with the European Union ETS. Thank you both for these 2 answers. And let me now turn to the industry issue. I mean, industry is absolutely critical. It represents in the EU about 9% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We have on the table the ETS reform, and I think a lot of participants in the audience come from the industry. What is your view on this ETS reform? Where and how should it be dealt with? The idea is to effectively help the industry to, trigger decarbonization, but without weakening our industries. So do you have the impression that the right instruments are there, that the right balance or coherence is there, or what could be further done in order to ensure that this is being done effectively while strengthening our industrial base? Pascal.
Okay, I start again. The next one will be for my colleague. Broadly speaking, I would say yes. Broadly speaking, the key elements of the reform are the good ones from the Commission, and I expect quite a wide support in the Parliament. I start with the level of the price. Of course, it's a market. We don't know exactly what the price will be, but in the impact assessment of the Commission, the targeted price, I would say, the target price, some sort of target zone, is 60 to 80 euros per ton of CO2 from now on up to the 2020 limit. And we are already at 60. And precisely because everything we design led to a 60 plus, I would say, carbon pricing. So it's a brand new situation. Everybody knows around this virtual table that we used to be in 5, 10, 15, 20, where the carbon price, to be honest, didn't have that much effect. Now we are entering the price down where it does have an effect. That's why, first, it's good. Second, we need to make sure that it's not a one shot, but it's over the whole decade. That's why we have this reform. And we have, of course, to have a level playing field when it comes to imports. Otherwise, I cannot go to a cement worker and say, well, forget about your job, it will be relocated in Ukraine, because in Ukraine they pay 0 for carbon. So that's why there will be the CBAM, and I guess that we will have another opportunity to discuss about the CBAM, but it's completely integrated part of the ETS reform and the fact that we are now in a 60+ price zone. Another element of the reform, which is a good one, is the extension to maritime and aviation, and it's more than needed to have all the sectors paying carbon as they should, and they should have done actually years ago. Another element of the ETS reform is the extension to buildings and road transport, and I already mentioned that. I'm quite skeptical, so the last comment I will say, and I expect a lot of debate in the parliament on this specific issue, is the phasing out of free allowances. Of course, you can have a 60 euros or 70 euros price. If you do not pay it for the whole carbon you emit, it limits considerably the impact. At the same time, I understand that you need a smooth transition and not a shock otherwise. And at the same time, for a company, it might be complicated first to invest in a zero carbon process, cement, steel, and so on, and at the same time, asking them to pay for 60, 70 euros for the whole CO2 they emit. So that's why we need to find the right path. But my feeling, after having heard the first exchange of views in the parliament, in the ENVI committee, and knowing that it's also the Renew position, and I guess it's also the Green, the Left, and the SND position, I think there will be a majority, at least in ENVI, then we will see in the plenary, but at least in the ENVI committee, to be a bit more stringent on the phasing out of free allowances, so that companies will pay CO2 price for real, on their real emission, and not on a limited part of their emission, then again, in a spirit of compromise, but also a spirit of consistency with our climate act.
Thank you, Pascal. Henrike?
Thank you very much for the interesting question. So I think, unfortunately, with the proposed ETS reform, the Commission is missing a unique opportunity to put a clear, strong signal to set the EU industry on a sustainable path towards climate neutrality. Of course, this would have been a wonderful opportunity to do that, but the Commission just failed. There will be no clear price signal that will spur the decarbonization of the EU industry until 2036, as free permits will only be completely phased out by then. So at the same time, the Commission proposes to increase carbon pricing for cars and buildings in an untargeted way, and with a limited instrument to compensate for the social impacts of such measure on poorest households. We talked before about these critical issues, right? It has to be a just transition. And not only this proposal may create social unrest, but it will have a much lower impact on reducing emissions than applying more ambitious CO2 targets to car makers and obliging member states to launch a massive wave of building renovation to use the instruments we have already, in particular the Recovery and Resilience Facility, to do so. So that means also that phasing out free pollution permits for intra-EU flights until 2027 is a step in the right direction, but unfortunately international aviation is mostly left off the hook. And finally, we welcome the extension of the EU ETS to maritime transport as initially requested by the Greens almost a year ago, I think. So I think there are several aspects we can be more ambitious. We have still a lot to do. And of course, I mean, if you look, for example, for the Commission proposal, Pascal was talking about that before as well, to achieve the new 2030 climate target of a minus of 52.8 emissions reduction by 2030, we think we need an overall emission reduction of minus 70% for ETS sectors compared to 2005, which is the minimum necessary to reach at least minus 65% economy-wide emissions reduction by 2030, and to put those sectors firmly on the path to climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. You were showing, dear Marc-Antoine, at the beginning, these figures, right? And the ambition of the EU. So we should really not only stick with that, but also be more ambitious, because we can and because we have to be that.
Well, at least, yes, judging from Germany, it's remarkable, because 3 years ago, there was little consensus on carbon neutrality. Then there came consensus, and now there's consensus on reaching that neutrality in 2045 already. And the discussion indeed also in Germany points to maybe even advancing that to 2040. So very interesting. Perhaps just a quick follow-up question to both of you. Would you suggest that what needs in addition is a carbon price floor that is clearly identified, with clear identified steps up until these free allowances are totally taken out?
Why not? But it is so so far from I would say the ideological mindset of the Commission that the likeliness of such a floor price to be introduced is close to zero. I mean, it's not at all in the proposal from the Commission. Not that many members are supporting in the Parliament, and same for the countries in the Council. So I think there are different ways to reach the same objective than having a explicit floor price, which theoretically I understand the objective, of course. The first way is to use the market reserve. That's the first thing, and it's already scheduled, and then we will work on the modalities on that in the negotiation. And the second, which I think is quite interesting as well, and maybe even more than the floor price, is the contract for difference. The carbon contract for difference, which is introduced in this reform, and I think could be even further pushed in the Parliament, is a bit, to my view, even better instrument than the floor price, because it has the same impact, meaning that you put a sort of guarantee that the carbon price will be a minimum of X. That's the basic contract for difference objective, but you can adjust it sector per sector, or even if you want to be very granular, company per company or project per project. So let's say sector per sector, because of course the floor price which is relevant for cement is not actually the same floor price which is relevant for electricity and for fertilizer. So using the contract for difference allows, to my view, to have the same objective with more flexibility and more relevance and impact. So I will intend to work on this specific issue to use this first element put in the reform by the Commission and to see how we can even strengthen it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think it's just been introduced also in the Netherlands to support carbon capture and storage. And it was quite a success looking at the number of projects that will benefit from this support. Henrike, can we try again? I hope it works.
Oh, it works now. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Oh, yes.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, actually, also we Greens have a position on that. Of course, we think we need a strong CO2 price and no more free rides for polluters, that's for sure. And this means, of course, establishing a carbon floor price of €50 from 2023 and an increase of the carbon price to €150 by 2030 and 195 by the mid-2030s. And we think that this will ensure we achieve the phase out of coal in the EU by 2030 and decisively move towards 100% renewables. But of course, we need a strong political position behind that. I think also on the national level, we currently discuss, of course, as you know, that we have elections soon, means like a political player who really play that card as well, and that chance we have.
Thank you very much, and glad that we could hear you well. Let me perhaps now address one other fundamental issue, because of course we need citizens to stay on board firmly, and no one left behind. But we also need, of course, to continue building and ensuring the steady consensus among member countries. And we, of course, anticipate some controversies and some differences in views. In your view, what kind of legislative proposal will be most challenging, actually, to achieve there, be it from the member countries' perspective, or especially here in Parliament? Where do you think that areas could see much quicker progress? And you've already alluded to some of them. And how, in your view, could actually differences be bridged? Because we are all aware that time is very limited. We are actually already 10 years late with our decarbonization, and and 2030 is tomorrow. So how to make sure that the negotiations don't run for now 2.5 years, but actually that we and do not split off the EU further, but rather build this consensus without breaking the coherence of the entire package. Henrike.
Thank you very much. So many questions in one question. So actually, I think when we look at the Parliament's perspective, so the way and also unprecedented speed with the European Commission has had to frame its Fit for 55 climate package, it will be likely lead to lengthy and difficult negotiations with the European Parliament and the Council. Of course, it's a natural thing, but of course it will be time consuming. Normally, the Commission has enough time to consult widely on major drafts, to get key stakeholders on board, but this time getting 12 legislative proposals together in a matter of months precludes these. So I think we will spend a lot of working hours with that, but it's worth it, of course. So it's been widely a top-down exercise with the Commission rushing to put everything in it. And in consequence, we expect lengthy debates, lots of work, fleshing out what the proposals will entail in detail, and a deep analysis of all the pages will take weeks. And as a result, the trilogues with the Parliament and the Council could be very long through the current 6-month Slovenian presidency, and then might go into the French presidency, of course. There will be an intense lobbying by, as in general it is the case, NGOs, activists, parts of the industry, opponents of climate action as well. So let's see also what kind of role the German government will play in the Council in the future. Of course, we hope in a government that will think green, that's clear. But as for the changes, we need for sure institutional changes to allow common financing of EU budget to finance the climate transition, and we need to make sure national budgets are supporting the transition and ensure it brings opportunities for all without affecting the most vulnerable parts of the population. For example, I just currently work as the Green Shadow for the EU budget 2022 in the Budget Committee. And green priorities are, of course, climate, biodiversity, but also research and development, because we really need R&D for green industrial policy, right? So everything belongs together, the efforts of the member states, what we do in the Parliament, what is doing the Commission, and of course the systemical patterns are important here as well. But it's clear we have to act as quick as possible, because we have to decide now what will happen in the future decades, also on an industrial level. And so we have to be efficient and quick at the same time.
Thank you, Henrike. Pascal?
Well, so we will see in the Parliament how we can go as fast as possible. This is, of course, what we all want. There are 2 texts among the 14 text Fit for 2030 package that could go a bit faster than the others. Which is CBAM and standards for cars, CO2 standards for cars. But of course, we will have to make a trade-off, and I think we will make this decision probably the end of December, beginning of January, to know if we keep this as a package or if we allow for different timing depending on the level of agreement or the level of complexity of the text. Because there are pros and cons in the two scenarios, and we will decide depending on where we will be December, January. Then, of course, from a purely political angle, and if I take only two political elements, which is the French presidency of the EU and the German elections, that will make a big difference. We know that France and Germany have, to some extent, not converging, which is diverging views on some elements of the package, or at least not aligned. Germany is very much in support of the extension of the ETS to buildings and transport, or at least the current German government. France is not. France is very much supportive of the CBAM. The least I can say is that Germany is reluctant to the CBAM, and Olaf Scholz himself is not very much in favor. So we will have to face this under the French presidency. So that we can find a deal to go fast. And of course, the more we want to change the current proposal, the more time it will take. And that's why also in interest of time and speed climate action, we need to calibrate the change we want to introduce, not to open things that will require 2 years of negotiation. So we are all aware of that. And of course, I think the first next step from a political angle to know if we would go fast or not is the result of the German election, as it was said before.
Yeah, thank you. And talking about Germany, it's not only Olaf Scholz, but also listening to discussions within the CDU. It seems that a person like Friedrich Merz, who might become a leading minister in a CDU-led government, is also strictly opposed to that, and is pledging towards opening up new free trade agreements, notably with Canada, but probably he also has Australia in mind. So indeed, these differences are very deep. Henrike, as we speak about Germany, would like to comment on that.
Well, I think at the moment, of course, you know, what we have in the debate is, of course, the interests of the industry, right, of the economy. And I think it's always, when you talk about these kind of issues, how to, a question that we also ask at the European level, how can we make companies or the green economy in general sustainable, resilient, and competitive? And of course, I mean, if we talk about CBAM and all the other implications, this is something we also have to take into account, but at the same time to integrate in our considerations. For example, when we work with incentives, as we did with the Just Transition Fund, for example, or in the recovery package, right? When we invest now money, we should do that in a way that we think of future climate protection as well as the concerns the economy needs, right? And I think in that that is something that is very much in the discussion in Germany, and I think there are different paths. It is considered that we can fulfill these requirements somehow, right? And some declare that they fight for climate action also on a political level. But if you look, for example, in the European Parliament, and you look at the precise decisions we take or the amendments or something, then you can see that there are very different perspectives. And this is something we can see in Germany as well, of course.
Thank you. And moving now perhaps to one decisively new dimension which we are facing in today's world, and which will become increasingly the case as we move forward. This is the geoeconomic competition, the global rivalries that we see everywhere, and which the COVID has actually, of course, strengthened further. And the question there would be, would you consider that the Fit for 55 package makes Europe fit for that battle? Are we strong enough? Do we have enough in support mechanism, etc. I look at the United States, for example, where everybody always talks about China, but let's look at the US. The US infrastructure package is extremely aggressive in the amount of public subsidies that will be handed out to the private sector. Do you have the impression that obviously the US intention is more to lead on the field of job creation, technology, innovation, and market share globally, and I'm not sure that the ultimate end goal is decarbonization in the way that we have it here in Europe. So, do you think that the Fit for 55 package is robust enough in these important areas? So, shall we do more? Pascal.
Well, first, the Fit for 2030, again, as we call it in the Parliament, Fit for 2030 package is one package among a broader package, okay, the Green Deal. If I take only the legislative dimension of the Green Deal, and I do not even mention the monetary policy of the ECB, for instance, but just the legislative dimension, it's more than 50 laws, 50 European laws that will be changed from now on, well, let's say from last year actually to the end of 2022. And when you change more than 50 laws at the same time, then you have a systemic change. For instance, everything which is related to reciprocity in public tender, it's an element of the Green Deal, but it's not in the Fit for 55 package. Everything related to green finance and so on is not in the Fit for 2030 package, but it's in the Green Deal. So we should have an even broader view than this package when it comes to climate strategy and the Green Deal. Second, if you look at the geopolitics of that, if you consider that there are two key transitions ongoing from an economic perspective, the first one is the digital, the second one is the green. On the digital, okay, let's face reality, China and US are leading the way. We try to reduce the gap, we try to find a niche where we can lead. We set standards and so on, but the global leaders are China and the US. When it comes to the other race and the other stake, we are leading the way. Europe is the part of the world where there are the largest number of green licenses and green patterns than China, than US, and so on. So we are leading. And to be honest, you won't find many topics where EU is leading the economic and technological race. Second, and that will be the second element, to my view, when you look at human capital and green patterns, we are leading. When you look at fossil fuels, stocks, reserves, we are the poorest continent in the world. We do not have that much gas, we do not have oil, and so on, compared to obviously the US, China, and so on. It means that, or Russia, or whatever. So we are the richest on one side, we are the poorest on the other. So switching from a fossil fuel-based economy to a green technology-based economy leading to decarbonization is directly our economic interest. More than others. That's precisely why we are leading. It's circular, but that's why we shouldn't be afraid of that race, because it's probably the only race we can win. So let's keep leading, and of course, leading means moving forward, but means also looking backward, trying to pull the others. Otherwise, you do not lead; you just have the race alone. So that's why I'm not at all afraid, from a geopolitical and geoeconomics perspective, of this road to carbon neutrality. On the contrary.
Thank you, Pascal. Henrike?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, if you look at the Fit for 55 package, it is, of course, in the core of the Green Deal, and the Green Deal should be in the core of every legislative measurements in the future, right, in the following years. So it's one aspect, and now the Fit for 55 package is focusing on climate, but of course we had agri aspects, the climate law the beginning of this year. So there are many issues we have and we have to work on. And of course, when we talk about the Fit for 55 package, the CBAM is likely to be particularly charged both within the EU and internationally, as it would impose import taxes on goods arriving from outside the EU while triggering a shift away from the existing approach to protecting industry from carbon leakage, because you were talking about the competition aspect, right, with EU and China. And this proposal has already delivered in some ways with reactions in the US, China, and even Russia, which is looking at establishing its own ETS to protect its exporting industries. And of course, that's something we have to take into account as well. We have to observe. When it came to EU industry, however, our position is that environmental integrity and climate efficiency of the mechanism are weak, as no details are given on the extension to the additional sectors in a second phase. And there's coexistence of CBAM and free allowances through a too long transition period. So this is one aspect we have to consider as well. And then WTO compatibility might also be at stake at the proposal is weak on the climate aspects, as many trade partners would regard the existence of free allocations alongside a levy as double protection, providing them ground for retaliation. So of course, the allocation of CBAM revenues is a big source of concern, and the EU identifies carbon border revenues as an own resource rather than using them for international climate efforts. And this might make it more difficult for the EU to explain the environmental protection objective of the instrument. But of course, we need international solidarity in the fight against climate change. We have, this is something which is substantial, of course, but as Pascal was saying as well, we have to lead in the EU. We have the chances to lead also in the technology sector, for example. That is very important. And just let me add as a very interesting point as well, for example, because you were talking about the competition aspect, I currently work on the critical raw materials. And that is something that is very interesting, of course. We all know that the global competition for access to critical raw materials is necessary for our ecological and digital transition. It is very important, but on the other hand, Pascal was talking about it, right? We don't have the same resources like China has, for example, but it doesn't have to lead, for example, what we currently discuss with our amendments to mining in protected nature and naturata areas in the EU, right? So we really have to be very careful. Instead of that, we have to focus on circular economy, resource efficiency, to look for alternatives and be very careful also with the paradigms and methodology we work, for example, when we criticize critical raw materials being responsible for green technology, which is actually not the case, even if the Commission is saying that or spelling that out in that way, because it's only a certain amount of critical raw materials that is responsible for that. So we need the right methodology and patterns really to have the base for a green industrial strategy, right? To work with real figures and instead of going out of the blue and working wildly in a different direction. So we have to be careful and wise also with where we want to invest money, research and development, and all these kind of things, and then we can get successful because we want to lead in the in the EU, right? With green technology and support climate change, to fight against climate change in the most effective way.
Thank you, Henrike. And I'd like to turn now to Carole. Thanks to all of you, dear participants, who raised the questions. And Carole will try to put them together, and then I will give the floor back to Pascal and then you, Henrike, for a final comment on these questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to join the discussion and happy to see so many questions. So I'll try to wrap them up and maybe raise 3 topics and ask for your reactions. I think the first topic that comes up relates to industry decarbonization and CBAM. It's no surprise. So as you said, there's a strong commitment behind CBAM. The proposal is on the table. Now it's likely that it will be put in place, but at the same time, the EC sees the many legal and practical obstacles, so it takes a very gradual, cautious approach. So it's more kind of a pilot project and not a really impactful measure at this point. But on the same time, you seem to suggest that the free allocation system should be revised and maybe it should be phased out earlier than what the EC suggests. So does it mean that you want a more powerful CBAM to compensate for these anti-leakage potential? Second question, I think, relates to the second ETS for road transport and heating fuels. The European Commission often insists on the need to have a coherent package, 2030 package, that we need all the pieces of the puzzle to reach the at least minus 55%. Now, if we decide that this second ETS is not a sensible option, as you seem to suggest, what other changes would you like to see in the package? And I think a third question that is raised relates to energy prices in general. We mentioned carbon prices, but we are in a context of surging gas and electricity prices at the same time. So what do you think it means for the ongoing negotiations and also potentially for the short term and this winter? I'll leave it there and ask for your reactions.
So Pascal, and we know that you have to then run in 5 minutes, and so you of course free then to go. Pascal.
Okay, so thank you for these questions that are at the heart of the negotiation of the package in the Parliament and also in the Council. So I start with CBAM. I mean, yes, we want in the Parliament a stronger CBAM, meaning broader and with more teeth. And of course, as it was said, as we cannot have double protection, otherwise it's not WTO compatible, it means that we can phase out in a more stringent way the free allowances. But of course, we won't do it if there is no CBAM at the same time. So it's completely circular. And I would add, regarding the free allowances debate, I would add that I would like to think about what we could call the conditionality of the free allowances. And again, the Commission in its package put a finger in it. To my view, it's a good way forward, meaning that if you invest in green technologies, then you cannot pay twice. You are not going to pay first for the investment in zero carbon steel, let's say as an example, and at the same, which will provide CO2 reduction over the decade, and at the same time keep on paying if we phase out dramatically free allowances. But on the contrary, if you have free allowances and you do not invest at all, then it's just a blank check. So I think the good balance is to say, okay, it's a sort of act or pay system. Or you invest or you pay. And if you invest, you are not going to pay twice, but you cannot be in a situation where you do not invest and you do not pay, which is too often what we saw in the past. So I think there is a balance here to be struck, and that's what I'm going to work on related to CBAM, because again, as I said at the beginning, everything in this is circular. On ETS, and the second ETS, you know, the point is about the acceptability of this and the rationality. I take an example in heating and an example in transport. If you live 30 kilometers away from the where you work and you have to go to the school to get your kids, and then if you are not in a city center, you usually need your car. That was at the core of the Yellow Jackets thinking, saying, I don't have any alternative anyway. So it's just, I'm going to pay. and I don't want, or I can't. And to be honest, this problem is not solved at all by the social fund put in place. So the core of the discussion will be, does it have any climate impact if I just make people pay more without giving them alternative? And that's why we need, if we go to extend the ETS, we need to be very much granular into what is the scope of people covered, what is the scope of people exempted. Because, and it's a very strong concern I have, is that the Commission tends to consider that families are economically rational as companies. And I can tell you that carbon pricing works in theory if the actors are rational. That's the basic economic theory. And you could argue, which I think you could argue, that economic or companies, corporates, are economically rational because they invest, they can make profitability calculation over the next decade and so on, relative pricing and so on and so on. And they can hire, they can fire, they can change their suppliers and so on. If you're a family, you're not going to fire your kids. You're not going to change the location of your job just because it will cost you 10 euros more for your car. I mean, it just not make sense because we are not economically rational. We are much more short-term constraints as families and as households. So that's why you cannot apply the same theory of change. And if you, another example, housing. If you are a tenant, okay, you pay for the bill, but actually who can make the work? The owner. So you are going to pay the price for the ETS2, and who gets the check? The owner. So that's very, there are a lot of friction. And in theory, if everybody would be rational, if there would be in a neoliberal world, it might work. In reality, it will not work. So that's why I'm against this tool. I don't, for political, but also for climate reasons, because I think it's not that impactful. That's why I question the reasoning saying if you kill that, then you need alternative. Yes, and we will have to make sure to have alternatives. But when you look at the impact assessment of the Commission, you see that a lot of assumptions of the Commission on the impact of the extension of ETS2, to my view, are questionable. Actually, the real thing is about money, including money for the recovery facility. And I can tell you that if you start going public saying, okay, I'm going to pay back the recovery facility of the EU with your sort of tax on fuel, you're not going to be very popular. So, and even the CDU is against this narrative. So that's why the political dimension of this reform regarding the extension of the ETS is very, very complicated in the Parliament and in the Council. That's why there is a lot of space for debate. Then again, I don't have the landing zone yet, but I think that will be a question that's for sure.
Thank you so much, Pascal. And should you need to go, a warm greetings and thanks from all of you. Henrike, we have 5 minutes left. Please, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. So thanks for the interesting questions. Of course, on CBAM, I was talking before in a long way. So, but let's come to the ETS question right away. So I think all ETS revenues should be used to finance climate action, but of course the devil is in the details. The Commission proposes to oblige member states to use 100% of ETS revenues for climate action, instead of at least 50% currently, but it doesn't foresee a clear exclusion of direct or indirect support to fossil fuels. And the list of activities can be financed is not revised and still includes in particular support for low carbon technologies, CCS, and low emission transport modes. And of course, we are critical of that as Greens. And then let's look at the point of the increase of the modernization fund and exclusion of fossil fuels projects. The League foresees doubling the size of the modernization fund to support energy efficiency and the modernization of energy systems of Eastern European countries, and ensuring support goes only to renewable energy projects. No support should go to energy generation facilities that use fossil fuels, for example. I think that these are, of course, interesting aspects. The extension of the scope of the Innovation Fund to support carbon contracts for difference and the decarbonization of maritime transport. Of course, we have to take that into account. And just let me check from the questions that was also talked about public and about transport, right? The aspects of road transport and buildings. I think the increased and untargeted carbon pricing for road transport and buildings will not deliver the necessary change in those sectors and may create social unrest. Instead of that, more ambitious binding CO2 targets should be applied, for example, to car makers and investment into buildings renovation. But restriction means also incentives, right? We have to work with all that together. So don't be afraid, I would tell the industry, right? So we are even more concerned by the lack of political acceptance of such measures, that in the meantime, the Commission proposes to create free allocations for the industry. So we may end up in a situation where citizens are asked to pay more for their emissions while the industry will continue to enjoy a free pass, right? So we have to come to a middle perspective here somehow, right? And to work together. And the transition must be fair, to remind on that again. And everyone must contribute its fair share, including the industry. And for example, if you look at the German Greens perspective we have at the moment, this is something that we don't have at the European level yet. Actually, we want to bring forward the increase of the CO2 price to 60 euros, the one that I mentioned before, to the year 2023. And after that, the CO2 price should rise in such a way, in concert with the measures and regulatory requirements, to ensure that the new climate target is achieved. And we Greens, we want to return the revenues from the national CO2 price directly to the people as energy money, as so-called energy money per capita to the people, to ensure that climate protection is socially just. And that's an idea we don't have, of course, at the European level, but it is also in a way you can also explain people what it means, right? That they don't have to be scared, that they really could profit from that, especially poorer people, right, who don't have as much money in their pocket as they should have or as they have. And I think these are, of course, aspects that are interesting as well.
Yes, indeed, Henrike, and we've followed also this proposal in the German electoral context, this energy money. Actually, it might be called carbon money. And indeed, I think this is an interesting proposal, and I noted that the two other parties did not really pick up on these kind of redistributional schemes. Time has been running out extremely fast. It's been a fascinating discussion, and of course we could have continued endlessly, and I know that there's been comments and questions unaddressed, but regrettably we don't have more than an hour together. So I'd like to thank you, Henrike, Hahn, warmly for the time you spent with us. Wish you also every best for your continuing work in the Parliament and bringing this hopefully quickly and forward. I'd like to thank Carol and Cécile as well, and the entire Ifri team, and especially you, dear participants. Wishing you a good weekend, and looking forward to welcoming you at the next Ifri events. And just to inform you that we have in the coming 15 days 4 very important papers coming out you might be interested in, of course, on the German election, and especially looking into the energy and climate discussions within the campaign. And I think that should be interesting also for our French audience. And also 2 papers digging into carbon capture and storage or utilization issues in Europe, and 1 very important one on hydrogen. And kind of bringing things back down to earth, and especially looking into how realistic are the new international hydrogen value chains that might be established. So thanks to all. Good afternoon, good weekend, and looking forward to welcoming you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.